At 5:11 on the morning of August 3, 1967, Corporal Louis Hart lay flat against the wet laterite soil of eastern Quang Ngai Province, 30 yards from a Viet Cong tunnel entrance no squad in his battalion wanted to approach a second time. A low river fog crept over the paddies. Water dripped from the bamboo in slow, regular beats. Hart's face was streaked with sweat, grit, and a finger's smear of charcoal. In his hands rested not an M16 like the men around him carried, but a short, battered Winchester Model 1897 pump shotgun with its bluing worn down to raw steel. Someone in the platoon had called it the junk shotgun 2 weeks earlier. The name had stuck. The entrance ahead of him was barely visible, a dark oval cut into the sloping earth at the base of a knotted treeline. It was the kind of tunnel mouth that looked empty until it wasn't. 2 days earlier, a Bravo Company fire team had stepped too close. A command-detonated charge shattered the point man's legs. A second blast took the grenadier. The survivors had pulled back under sporadic AK fire, certain they had stumbled onto another branch of the tunnel network that ran under the district like veins under skin. Hart listened to the ground with his cheek pressed into the damp soil. Nothing. No shifting air. No metallic clatter. No scrape of sandals on wood. But the silence meant very little out here. The VC knew how to wait. They knew how to sit in the dark with their hands on a wire and their breath held tight in their chest until an entire patrol passed overhead. He tightened his grip on the Winchester's fore end. The wood felt smooth in the places where it had been repaired with 2 brass screws, rough where the finish had peeled away. The action, though old, locked into battery with the heavy, deliberate clack of a tool built long before the war had moved to jungles. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't modern. But in the next 90 minutes, it would give Hart an advantage no one in his platoon believed still existed. Behind him, a squad leader whispered a single reminder: no noise, no metal on metal, no unnecessary breathing. Hart nodded once. He didn't need the warning. He already knew something the others didn't. If a man had to fight underground in a place where light died after 3 feet and the air tasted like wet cement, he wasn't going to win a duel with a rifle. He was going to win with something that worked at arm's length. And the junk shotgun, no matter how many jokes it carried, had been built for exactly that distance. The terrain around Hart looked deceptively simple from a distance. A shallow rise of ground, a ribbon of bamboo, and a line of rice paddies stretching east toward the Song Tra Kuk River. But to anyone who had fought in Quang Ngai long enough, it was the kind of ground that made men uneasy. The infantry had a name for it, the shelf, because the earth rose just high enough to hide a man crouched behind it, and just steep enough to conceal mouths of tunnels carved into its face. Intelligence officers said the VC had been burrowing in this district since the early 1950s, long before Americans ever landed at Da Nang. Every ridge, every drainage ditch, every cluster of bamboo shoots might hold an entrance barely wider than a man's shoulders. Hart's platoon had seen what those entrances could do 2 days earlier. The first patrol had approached at mid-morning, when the heat shimmered above the paddies. The point man, Private First Class Torres, stepped off the narrow dike to investigate what looked like disturbed soil, lighter in color, just a shade and smoother than the rest. He never finished the second step. A buried pressure charge detonated under his boot heel, lifting him in a cloud of dust and throwing fragments across the patrol. The grenadier behind him rushed forward to drag him back. A second command-detonated charge tore through his left side. The survivors returned fire blindly at the treeline, but they couldn't see anything except the dark oval of the tunnel mouth sitting motionless in the slope. The platoon leader called a withdrawal. They fell back to a patch of ankle-deep water between paddies, counting limbs and tourniquets, still unable to identify where the sniper fire had come from. Later analysis suggested a firing slit concealed inside a secondary shaft, a trick the VC used often, digging a narrow chimney parallel to the main entrance, allowing a marksman to shoot from a protected angle, invisible except for a moment's flicker of muzzle flash. When battalion saw the casualty report that afternoon, they marked this entrance as probable node in a larger subterranean network. Aerial photographs showed faint depressions in the soil line stretching along the ridge, no more than shadows, but enough for the intelligence section to guess there were at least 3 mouths feeding the same underground artery. Air strikes were suggested and rejected in the same breath. There was a hamlet less than half a kilometer away, and too many civilians moved through that corridor before dawn. The artillery liaison offered smoke and VT variable time fuse, airbursts, but neither solution would collapse a tunnel throat without risking fragments raining over the village. A request for a tunnel rat team stalled. The nearest detachment was already engaged near Duc Pho. So the problem sat, raw and unresolved, in the lap of Hart's company commander. The captain gathered his NCOs under a poncho rigged between two M113s while rain dripped steadily from the canopy. He went over the map twice, the rise of the ground, the suspected vent shafts, the likely firing angles. Everyone agreed on one thing: sending another squad straight up to the mouth was asking to bring bodies home under ponchos. The company's senior sergeant put it bluntly. "Sir, they've got the choke point. We walk into that hole, they write the story." Meanwhile, Hart sat 10 yards away under the hull of an APC, methodically wiping condensation from the receiver of his battered 1897. He listened without interrupting. He already knew the rhythm of the conversation: risk, counter-risk, and a list of things that wouldn't work. The jungle made promises like that. It told a man he had choices. In reality, he usually had one. Most of the platoon didn't understand why he even carried the shotgun. The M16 weighed less, shot straighter, and didn't kick like a mule. But Hart had spent his childhood in cypress thickets in southern Arkansas, where visibility shrank to a tunnel of wet green no wider than a doorway. He tracked hogs through brush so tight a rifle barrel would snag on vines before a man saw what was coming at him. In those places he didn't need range. He needed certainty at 3 feet. The tunnels of Quang Ngai were not much different from those thickets, except that in a thicket the thing rushing at you did not have a grenade. What made the situation worse was what the engineers found during a brief daylight inspection from afar: small, unnatural mounds of earth, each no wider than a helmet, spaced irregularly along the ridge. Evidence of at least 2 secondary mouths. Just big enough for a man to crawl out of. Just small enough that Americans would overlook them until they were already taking fire. Second Lieutenant Keller, the platoon leader, voiced what the others were thinking. "If they have 3 exits and we only control one, we're clearing nothing. We're just bleeding in the dark." The operations officer scribbled notes. The artillery liaison shook his head. The XO swore softly. No one liked their odds. By evening, word had reached battalion that the complex needed to be neutralized before it became a safe corridor for VC units moving south along the district line. Higher command didn't say how to do it, only that it needed to happen without destroying the surrounding hamlets and without incurring more losses. The men of the platoon sat in a loose half-circle as the captain handed out the next day's assignments. No one met his eyes when he mentioned the tunnel entrance. A few glanced toward the bamboo line and then away again. The jungle was loud with insects, but a hush settled over the group when he asked for recommendations. For a moment no one spoke. The officers had ideas. The NCOs had warnings. The grunts had silence. Hart listened to all of it while rewrapping the frayed sling of his shotgun, one slow loop at a time. He didn't look up. He didn't raise his hand. Not yet. But every detail the officers discussed fit into a picture he already understood. Multiple exits, confined space, short engagement distances, minimal light, unpredictable angles. That picture had one answer. And though the rest of the company didn't know it yet, the battered shotgun in his lap, mocked, outdated, patched together with screws, had been built for precisely the kind of fight no one else wanted to think about. By dawn, the ridge would claim more men unless someone stepped into the dark on purpose. And in the silence beneath the poncho, Hart already knew he would be the one to volunteer. The patrol stepped off just after 21:30 on August 2nd, under a moon so thin it looked like a scratch on the sky. Night in Quang Ngai was never truly dark. There was always a reflected sheen off the paddies, a faint silver shimmer on the water, but the treelines swallowed that light before it reached the ridge. As the platoon moved in staggered file along the berms, the bamboo ahead of them looked like a single solid wall, a black mass with no depth. Hart walked in the middle of the column, not because he was meant to. His place on the roster rotated like everyone else's, but because the lieutenant liked to keep the shotgun where he could find it quickly. There were times, Keller had said, when a fast, certain blast mattered more than 3-round bursts. The men joked about that too. If Charlie ever jumps Keller, Hart's the insurance policy. But tonight no one joked. Not after Torres. Not after the Grenadier. The platoon's objective was simple on paper: confirm additional tunnel mouths, mark potential vent shafts, and assess whether the ridge was strengthening as a VC transit route. They were not to engage unless fired upon. They were not to approach the known entrance within 30 meters. The captain wanted eyes, not bodies. The problem was that the terrain didn't care what battalion wanted. By the time the patrol reached the northern flank of the ridge, the humidity had climbed so high it felt like the air itself had weight. Every step stirred the stink of decaying vegetation and old water trapped beneath the bamboo canopy. The point team halted twice to listen for movement, once because they thought they heard shovels, once because they caught a glimpse of what looked like disturbed soil at the base of a stump. Neither clue led to anything certain. In tunnel country, certainty was a luxury. At 22:11, the patrol reached a shallow depression that ran parallel to the slope. Keller signaled a halt. He crouched, scanned the dark line of earth in front of him, and motioned for the squad designated as the silent element. The men trained to move without metal rattling, to ease forward another 10 meters. Hart remained where he was, kneeling in the mud, one hand steady on the shotgun's receiver. He knew what the lieutenant was doing, testing the perimeter, feeling for the edges of the complex. But the jungle had its own way of betraying movement. A breeze shifted. A bird startled. Somewhere far off, a dog barked in the hamlet. The forest canopy trembled as if reacting to something the Americans couldn't see. The silent element froze. Then one of them raised a clenched fist. Not the signal for enemy sighting. The signal for pressure hazard. Keller slid forward until he was belly down beside the man. Hart watched the lieutenant's silhouette as he used the tip of his knife to scrape away a thin layer of soil. A faint click followed by a dull metallic tick echoed up the ridge. Even at a distance, Hart felt his stomach tighten. The engineers later identified it as a bamboo tension snare connected to a concealed fragmentation charge. Crude but effective. Enough to shred a man from the knees down. The lieutenant exhaled, slow and controlled. The men behind him didn't move. After disarming the snare, Keller angled the patrol east to skirt the ridge. If the VC had trapped the approach to the main entrance, there were likely other devices deeper in. The men shifted to a half-crawl, half-step gait, moving with the awkward, practiced caution of soldiers who knew the ground itself could kill them. 20 minutes later, they found proof that the network was larger than expected. A young corporal named Finley brushed aside a curtain of vines and revealed a vent shaft no wider than a helmet, disguised as a termite mound. The interior smelled of stale air and damp earth, exactly what tunnel rats described before contact. The shaft was angled just enough for sound to travel up. When they listened, they heard nothing, but the silence seemed heavier than before. Keller marked the coordinates on his map. Second mouth confirmed. The tension around the patrol tightened like a snare line. The men pushed deeper along the ridge, following curvature and intuition. This section of jungle felt wrong, too still, too neat. The ground, usually soft underfoot, was firm in patches as if packed recently from below. It was here at 23:08 that the patrol found the third sign, a shallow divot in the earth with a faint circular outline, as if someone had placed a lid over the opening and covered it hastily with soil. The VC weren't just using the network, they were actively expanding it. Keller called a halt and gathered the squad leaders under a cluster of low branches. They spoke in clipped whispers. 3 mouths. Unknown tunnels. Confirmed traps. Confirmed ventilation. And the ridge sloping in a way that suggested a main artery somewhere beneath their feet. One of the sergeants, a man who'd served since '65, said what everyone else already knew. "Sir, this isn't a hide. This is a transit line. They can move a platoon under us without us ever seeing them." Keller didn't dispute it. He folded his map and signaled for the patrol to retreat along the same path, retracing each step. The men moved out with deliberate care, scanning for wires where none should exist, stepping only where footprints already lay. When they reached the paddies, the tension finally bled from their shoulders. But none of them spoke as they crossed the dikes back to the temporary night position. When they returned to the company perimeter, the captain had already received preliminary reports from the earlier casualties. He listened to Keller's account in the dim light of a red lens flashlight, face unreadable. When the lieutenant finished, the captain closed the map slowly and said, "We'll need someone inside at first light. Or close enough to it." No one volunteered. Not yet. Not while the memory of the blast that took Torres still hung in the air like smoke. Hart sat a few meters away, stripped down to his undershirt, cleaning the Winchester by touch. He didn't look toward the officers. He didn't need to. The shape of the problem was clear. The ridge, its contour, its tunnels, its hidden exits, did not lend itself to standoff fire or cautious probing. Someone would have to go in. Or at the very least, someone would have to approach the mouths closer than 30 meters and survive long enough to understand their layout. As he eased the pump forward, listening to the familiar clack of the action, he felt the weight of the conversation behind him settling into something inevitable. The shotgun wasn't a modern solution. It wasn't regulation. It wasn't even respected. But he knew what it could do in a space no wider than a hallway. And he knew the others feared that space. When Keller dismissed the patrol and told the men to stand by for the morning brief, Hart slung the Winchester over his shoulder, looped his helmet strap through his fingers and walked toward the captain. He didn't speak loudly. He didn't need to. "Sir," he said quietly, I can get you inside 30 meters. And I can do it with this. He tapped the buttstock of the shotgun once, softly, like a man knocking on a door he already knew would open. The captain stared at him for a long moment. Then he nodded, slowly, as if conceding to something the ground had already decided. The briefing began at 4:12, under a poncho stretched tight between two radio trucks, its edges dripping a steady rhythm onto the red clay below. The platoon gathered in a half circle, boots sinking into the soft ground, helmets beaded with mist. No one spoke louder than a whisper, sound carried strangely at that hour as if the jungle itself were listening. The captain unrolled a map across an ammo crate, weighed down the corners with canteens, and pointed to the ridge line with the tip of a grease pencil. 3 Maus, he said. 1 confirmed deadly. 2 with signs of recent use. We don't need to clear the whole network. We need the entrances neutralized long enough to push the line south. A sergeant asked whether engineers could get close enough to set shaped charges. The captain shook his head. Not until we know the layout of the openings. 1 wrong blast and we open vents straight into the hamlet. Another NCO suggested gas. Rejected. Wind all wrong, too many civilians in the path. A corporal brought up calling for a tunnel rat team from division. Already attempted. No response, likely committed elsewhere. The conversation spiraled in circles, the same solutions hitting the same immovable walls. The ridge was a problem that refused to match the manual. The captain capped his grease pencil, rubbed the bridge of his nose, and finally said what everyone else had been avoiding. We need someone close enough to see the structure but far enough to stay alive. It wasn't a request. It was resignation in a quiet voice. Hart stood near the rear of the group, shotgun hanging from his sling, barrel angled toward the ground. The Winchester looked out of place among the black rifles and gleaming steel of the M16s. The others kept glancing at it the same way they always did, half amused, half suspicious, like a museum piece that kept showing up where it didn't belong. When the captain asked for recommendations, silence rolled across the group like fog. Then Keller, the platoon leader, cleared his throat. Sir. Hart's willing. Every head turned. Hart stepped forward without adjusting his gear, without theatrics. The captain studied him. Corporal, I know you volunteered. I'm asking if you understand what that means. I do, sir, Hart said. I won't go in blind. I'll go up to the mouths. Close enough to see the woodwork, vents, choke points. Close enough to map the angles. And your weapon? The captain asked. You're still planning to take that thing? Hart nodded. Yes, sir. The captain exhaled through his teeth. Corporal, that shotgun is older than most of the men here. Barrel's short. Action's loud. You'll get 1 shot before the whole ridge wakes up. Hart didn't argue. He simply reached up, racked the action with deliberate slowness, and let the metallic clack settle into the damp air. It wasn't the sharp snap of an M16 bolt. It was heavier, more certain, a mechanical promise from another era. This gun, Hart said, doesn't jam in mud. Doesn't choke on humidity. I can fire it from the hip in a tunnel without losing my sight picture. I don't need 20 meters. I need 1. And sir, the tunnels don't give you 20. Keller backed him. I've seen him shoot in brush thick as rope. Seen him track hogs through cypress. If anyone can handle 3-foot engagement ranges, it's him. One of the squad leaders murmured, or he just gets himself killed quicker. Hart didn't look at him. He didn't defend himself. He didn't need to. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out 3 shells, 2 buckshot, 1 a makeshift breaching round he'd carved himself with a file and bits of rock salt. He set them on the ammo crate. Sir, he said quietly, in the tunnels it's not about volume. It's about certainty. I won't miss at that distance. The captain stared at the shells, then at the worn stock of the shotgun. The brass screws glinted faintly in the half-light. It was an ugly weapon, battered and stubborn, too stubborn to die easily. The captain finally nodded. Fine. You take 2 men for security. No one goes inside a tunnel. Your job is reconnaissance and denial. If at any point it turns into a firefight, you break contact and pull back. Yes, sir. And Hart. The captain tapped the stock with 1 finger. Don't make me explain to battalion why you died carrying a relic. Hart allowed himself the faintest smile. I'll bring it back in 1 piece, sir. Same for me. The briefing dissolved. Men dispersed to check weapons, tapes, grenades. The jungle began to brighten with the earliest hint of gray dawn. Hart stepped under the tailgate of a truck, sat on an ammo case and began methodically loading his shotgun. Each shell slid into the tube with a soft click, each motion practiced thousands of times. He listened to the jungle waking, to insects shifting pitch, to the low thrum of generators spooling up at the rear. A young private walked over, hesitated, then asked, "Corporal, why that gun?" "Really?" Hart wiped condensation off the receiver with his thumb. "Because down there," he said, nodding toward the ridge, "there's no room for doubt. You get one heartbeat to survive. This gun doesn't need more than one." The private nodded slowly, perhaps understanding for the first time that confidence wasn't bravado, it was preparation sharpened into something plain and unglamorous. By 5 o'clock, Hart stood ready, shotgun slung, eyes fixed on the jungle wall ahead. Keller approached, gave a last quiet nod and checked his watch. 30 minutes, Keller said. "We move." Hart breathed once, slow and steady. The ridge waited. The tunnels waited. And the junk shotgun, ignored and laughed at for half a tour, would finally be tested in the one place it was born to work. The squad moved out at 5:32, just as the first thin light filtered through the cloud bank above Quang Ngai. Dawn didn't brighten the jungle so much as it revealed the shapes hiding inside it. Bamboo leaning like crooked spears, vines sagging with moisture, the faint silver sheen of spiderwebs large enough to catch a man's shoulder. The ridge ahead was still in shadow, and the air held that early morning stillness that comes before heat pushes every scent upward. It was the hour when the jungle felt suspended between night and day, a time when noises carried farther than they should. Hart walked second in the column, flanked by 2 men assigned as his support element. Specialist Rhodes behind him, steady, methodical, best shot in the platoon, and Private Jansen, the youngest in the squad, chosen not for experience but for his unflinching ability to keep quiet under stress. Their job wasn't to clear tunnels. Their job was to make sure Hart made it back to the Trilene alive. The approach to the first tunnel took them along the same route the patrol had used the night before, but in daylight the ground told a different story. Footprints softened by rain were now clear depressions. Bamboo stems bent at unnatural angles showed where men had brushed past in haste. Even the soil carried signs of disturbance, small collapses, ridged edges that indicated settling from below. The VC had been working the network recently, perhaps in the early hours before the Americans arrived. When the group reached the point where Torres had died, they stopped. The crater from the blast was still visible, the earth blown outward in a rough star shape. A burnt scrap of cloth clung to the root of a nearby tree. Jansen swallowed and looked away. Hart didn't. He let the details settle into his mind, not out of morbid fascination but because places like this taught lessons the manuals never did. He knelt, pressed a finger into the soil, feeling for looseness, for vibration, for the faint hollow that sometimes warned of space beneath. Nothing. Good. Or at least not immediately bad. Keller signaled them forward. The first entrance came into view at 5:47. It was smaller than Hart remembered from the night patrol, partly because the dawn light created a sharper contrast between earth and shadow. The mouth sat under a sloping overhang of packed clay, framed by roots that protruded like ribs. The opening wasn't tall enough for a man to crouch through normally, it had been carved for crawling, not walking. That alone told Hart something important. This tunnel was designed for movement, not storage. A passageway, not a chamber. He advanced alone to within 10 meters, leaving Rhodes and Jansen in a tight wedge behind a pair of low shrubs. From here, the world narrowed into details. The texture of the soil, the angles of the roots, the smell. He sniffed once, quietly. Moist air. Damp clay. A faint hint of smoke, recent but not fresh. No rot. No sulfur. No human waste. Tunnels held scent like a jar, and the wrong odor at the wrong time could mean half a dozen men inside preparing to counterattack. Hart unslung the shotgun, cradling it tight under his chest, finger outside the trigger guard. The weapon felt heavier near the ground, as if the weight of the earth drew it downward. He lowered to his stomach. The mouth of the tunnel loomed like an uneven oval, its edges worn smooth from years of hands pulling bodies through. Rhodes whispered from behind, barely audible, "Movement?" "Not yet," Hart murmured. He pressed his cheek to the soil, just like on the earlier approach, and let the earth speak. Sometimes you heard things through the ground you'd never catch in the air. A shifting weight, a foot against a wooden brace, the scrape of gear. Today there was only stillness. Which meant one of two things. The tunnel was empty. Or its occupants were waiting, silent, disciplined, listening to him as intently as he listened to them. Hart eased forward another meter, slow as a man inching across ice. The curve of the opening revealed the first few feet of interior, a dark throat scored with old tool marks. A small wooden support beam sat just inside, reinforced with a crosspiece. The VC built their supports by feel, not measurement, and the imperfect angle told Hart another detail. This entrance had been excavated quickly, maybe expanded recently. He leaned in, shotgun tucked tight, barrel angled slightly upward to avoid hitting the floor. His breathing slowed until he barely registered it. In the confined space of a tunnel entrance, one breath too loud could carry farther than a gunshot. Behind him, Rhodes held his M16 trained on the dark, eyes steady. Jansen kept watch on the flanks, scanning for secondary openings. Hart's hand brushed the clay. So cool. Not recently touched. He moved another foot inside, just enough to angle his head and see the first bend in the tunnel, where the passage veered left. That bend was the danger point. VC favored sharp turns to force attackers into kill zones. A man rounding a blind corner could take a burst of fire at a distance no longer than a mattress. Hart tightened the grip on the Winchester. Then he saw it, just a flicker almost imagined, a shift of shadow at the far edge of the bend. Not movement exactly. More like the absence of stillness. A faint tremor in the dark. Hart whispered, "Contact." He didn't wait for confirmation. He slid forward just enough to clear the entrance. The shotgun came up in one smooth motion born from habit, not thought. There was no time to aim, only to index the direction of the threat. At this distance, maybe 6 feet, the spread would be tight, the impact absolute. A silhouette lunged around the bend, low and quick, muzzle of an AK angled upward. Hart fired. Buckshot slammed into the confined space with a muffled, concussive bark that punched the air back toward the entrance. The blast lit the tunnel walls in a flash of orange, revealing a man mid-crawl, mouth open in surprise, weapon rising. The pellets struck center mass, driving him backward into the wall before his finger could tighten on the trigger. The tunnel swallowed the sound instantly, its walls drinking the echo like water. Hart chambered another round without conscious thought. Pump forward, pump back. The clack of the action felt enormous in the tight space, though in reality it was no louder than a snapped branch. He waited. Another shadow shifted deeper inside. Not a body, just the implication of one. A hand? A shoulder? A foot retreating into darkness? He fired again, a controlled shot angled lower this time. Clay spat upward from the floor. A muffled yelp echoed, followed by the scuffle of retreat. Someone crawled deeper, scraping against the walls. Hart didn't pursue. That wasn't the mission. His job was to map the opening, disrupt immediate threats, and survive long enough to report. He backed out slowly, never turning his back to the darkness. When his boots touched outside soil again, Rhodes exhaled in relief. "How many?" Rhodes asked. "One confirmed. Maybe 2 more inside. They're moving away." "Ambush?" "Not yet. They weren't set. They were listening." Jansen swallowed. "Sir, you going back in?" Hart looked at the tunnel mouth. The darkness inside looked deeper now, as if the earth held its breath. "Not this one," he said. "It's too tight. But we know something now." "What's that?" Rhodes asked. Hart tapped the barrel lightly with a knuckle. "That they're close. And that this works at the distance they're fighting." He didn't mean the shotgun was perfect. He meant it was appropriate. 2 different things. But in tunnel country, appropriate was survival. By 6:09, they had marked the entrance, counted their observations, and prepared to move to the second mouth. The jungle hadn't grown louder. But something in it felt more awake. They reached the second entrance at 6:23, after a careful half-circle around the ridge's northern shoulder. The sun was climbing but hadn't yet burned through the low haze drifting over the valley. Light came in slanted beams, pale and uncertain, filtering through layers of bamboo like blades of glass. The ground felt different here, firmer, more compacted. Rhodes noticed it first. "Feels tamped," he whispered, pressing his boot heel into the clay. "Harder than the other one." Hart crouched beside him, running his fingers through a patch of soil. The texture was wrong, coarse in places, powdered in others. Artificial. Someone had disturbed the ground recently, not with careless movement but with intent. "VC used packing sticks," Hart murmured. "Probably braced the mouth." The entrance itself was larger than the first. A horizontal slit hacked into the ridge, 2 feet tall, 4 feet across, framed with rough wooden beams. A thin sheen of moisture coated the inner edge, glistening like sweat. But what caught Hart's eye wasn't the mouth, it was the vegetation around it. Bamboo stalks leaned at unnatural angles, their tips cut clean as if by a blade. Not random. Not storm damage. Signs of tripwire placement. "Jansen," Hart whispered, "don't move another step." The young private froze mid-stride. Hart scanned the area. Tripwires didn't announce themselves. They hid in the negative space between shadows and stems. He looked for what wasn't there, gaps in foliage, straight lines where nature preferred curves, a faint discoloration where fingers had handled wire. There, a thin strand of monofilament stretched between two low roots, invisible unless the sun hit it at just the right angle. Claymore? Rhodes asked. Hart shook his head. VC don't waste claymores. Probably a grenade on a stick. Maybe a punji pit behind the trigger. He motioned for Rhodes to hold position, then lay flat against the earth and inched forward like a man sliding under a porch. His cheek skimmed the clay, eyes narrowing as he traced the wire's path. It led to a shallow depression on the left flank of the entrance. The soil bulged slightly, an indicator that something waited beneath. Hart pulled a short length of bamboo from his pack. Not standard issue. Picked up from the ground earlier. Useful for one thing, displacing weight without exposing a hand. He extended the stick toward the depression and applied the faintest pressure. A soft click. Then the muted shift of earth collapsing inward. Dust billowed from the hole. Hart pulled back instantly. A cluster of sharpened stakes rasped upward, their tips smeared with a substance he knew too well. A mix of dung, plant resin, and whatever else the VC had to accelerate infection. A punji trap, simple, cheap, and reliably crippling. Rhodes whispered, "Hell?" Hart dusted his hands. "They don't want us close. Means there's something inside worth protecting." He approached the tunnel mouth again, more cautiously this time. The opening sloped downward at a shallow angle, then flattened into a narrow corridor just tall enough for a man on hands and knees. Unlike the first tunnel, this one smelled faintly of human presence. Smoke, sweat, and the sour tang of bodies confined underground. Hart took that as confirmation. Someone had been inside recently. Maybe still was. He signaled to the others. Standard protocol, 2 cover outside, 1 inside for reconnaissance. But Hart knew protocol rarely survived first contact with a tunnel. "We do this slow," he said. "You stay outside unless you hear me call." Jansen nodded, tense but steady. Rhodes kept his rifle trained on the darkness. Hart eased in. The temperature shifted immediately, dropping several degrees. Air inside was denser, heavier. The shotgun felt oversized in the confined space, but he angled it across his body, muzzle forward. His elbows brushed the tunnel walls. Clay crumbled softly under his sleeves. The wooden support beam overhead looked newer than the others he'd seen. Fresh cuts on the edges, splinters still clinging. Someone had reinforced this recently. A bad sign. Reinforcement meant use. Use meant defenders. The tunnel ran straight for about 8 feet before splitting into a T-junction. Hart paused at the intersection, letting his ears adjust. Sound behaved strangely underground. It bounced, folded, hid in corners. He listened for the rhythms of life. Breathing, gear shifting, the rasp of skin against dirt. A faint scrape echoed from the right branch. Slow. Deliberate. He signaled twice, quiet hand motions in the dark, to confirm he was proceeding. Then he angled right. The passage tightened. Clay brushed his shoulders. The smell grew stronger. Earth, sweat, faint tobacco. He was close. Too close for hesitation. Then he saw it. A glint of light reflecting off a metal edge not 6 feet ahead. Not a weapon. A tripline peg hammered into the right wall, barely visible under packed soil. Hart froze, studied it. 1 peg. 1 line. But where was the second? VC traps rarely relied on a single anchor. He searched the opposite wall and found its twin, buried deeper, tilted down. Between them a wire, almost invisible. The slightest pressure on that wire would likely trigger a grenade or a falling weight trap placed deeper inside. He didn't have the angle to disarm it safely. He needed another solution. Hart shifted his grip on the shotgun, pointing the barrel upward toward the roof of the passage. He pressed the muzzle gently against a wooden support beam running perpendicular to the tunnel. Then he applied pressure, not enough to break it, just enough to test the beam's give. The wood flexed. Weak. No. Improvised quickly. That meant something important. If the VC had set a trap beyond the wire, they needed the supports to hold. Weak supports meant the trap might be more primitive, a weighted log, maybe a pit, something easy to reset. He found his angle. Hart raised the shotgun 1 inch, shifted his weight, and fired upward. The blast was deafening in the confined space. Dirt and splinters rained onto his helmet. The support shattered, collapsing a small section of the roof just ahead of the tripline. Clay spilled onto the wire, burying it under several inches of packed earth. Whatever device had been tied to the line was now entombed beneath the collapsed section. Rhodes heard the shot outside and tensed, weapon ready. Jansen whispered, "Is he okay?" Rhodes didn't answer. He listened. Hart pushed forward again, clearing debris with his forearm. The collapse had widened the passage slightly, enough for him to see what the trap had been. A rusted grenade cup rigged to a wooden dowel, connected to the line with frayed twine. Crude. Deadly. Now neutralized. He exhaled. Then movement. A fast scrape. So fast he barely registered it before instinct took over. A figure lunged from the left branch of the tunnel, someone who had been waiting silently until Hart committed to the right. The VC soldier swung an entrenching tool like a hatchet, the blade gleaming in the dimness. Hart fired from the hip. At this distance, no more than arm's length, the buckshot hit with brutal efficiency, throwing the attacker sideways into the wall. The entrenching tool clattered to the floor. Hart pumped the action again, ready for a second strike, but none came. He checked the left branch quickly. No more shadows. No breathing. Only dust settling. He backed out slowly, same careful pace as before, never turning his back on the dark. When he emerged into daylight, Rhodes checked him for wounds, patting shoulders, arms, helmet. You good? Fine, Hart said. One attacker. One trap disabled. Tunnel goes deeper, multiple branches. Jansen stared at the entrance, eyes wide. Corporal, did you shoot the ceiling? Yeah, Hart replied simply. Better it collapses on their trap than on us. Keller arrived minutes later, breath quick, expression tight. Hart gave the report with minimal embellishment. Angles, distances, trap construction, likely occupancy. The lieutenant asked, assessment? Hart wiped clay from the shotgun's barrel. This one's different from the first. Built for defense. Not for retreat. And the men inside? Alert. Disciplined. Not many. But waiting. Keller nodded, jaw clenched. And your shotgun? Hart glanced at the weapon, the scuffed receiver, the burnished pump, the steam rising faintly from the barrel. It's doing exactly what it needs to do, he said. At 6:51, they marked the second tunnel on the map and moved toward the third. The jungle felt heavier now. Not louder, just more aware. As if each footstep pressed closer to a line that had been waiting for decades to be crossed. They reached the third entrance at 7:09, just as the haze began to lift and the jungle shifted from gray to green. The sun hadn't yet burned off the moisture clinging to the ridge, and every leaf glittered with condensation. This section of terrain felt older than the others, less disturbed, more deliberate. Bamboo arched above like ribs of a great animal, and the ground sloped inward to form a natural bowl, the kind that could hold sound, hide movement, or funnel an unwary patrol into the wrong place. Hart felt it as soon as his boots sank into the softer earth. The ground here wasn't just moist. It was warm. Subterranean heat. A sign of deeper chambers below, where human bodies had been gathered recently. Rhodes noticed it too. Soil temps up, he whispered. Jansen ran a hand over a patch of mud. Feels like it's breathing. The entrance itself was deceptive. Small, almost too small. A narrow oval sunk into the ridge at shin height, barely wide enough for a man on his belly. Where the first two mouths bore the scars of rushed construction or recent expansion, this one looked aged, worn down by countless passes. The clay around the lip had been polished by elbows and shoulders, the wood supports darkened with years of moisture. Moss clung to the outer edges, growing in faint rings around the perimeter. Hart crouched low, studying the shape. This one's old, he murmured. Old means deep. Deep means vents. Means defenders, Rhodes added. Hart nodded. Unlike the earlier tunnels, this mouth emitted a faint plume of warm air, barely visible, but enough to distort the edges of the opening when light hit it. That meant the tunnel had internal airflow, likely driven by a secondary exit or a concealed chimney farther upslope. It also meant someone had cleared obstructions recently. Hart signaled the others to hold back as he approached alone. The smell reached him first. Earth, of course. Always earth. But layered beneath it were other scents: sweat, stale tobacco, damp fabric, and something metallic like tools left too long in humidity. He lowered to his stomach, shotgun angled ahead. The weapon felt heavier than before, as if absorbing the tension that hung in the air. The Winchester had already taken mud, dust, and clay without complaint. But now, as Hart pressed forward, he knew the margin for error had evaporated. In tunnels like this, everything came down to inches. He pushed his head inside. The temperature jumped immediately. The air hugged his skin like wet cloth. Breathing wasn't difficult yet, but each breath felt thick, slower than it should. The tunnel angled down sharply, steeper than the others, and its walls were smooth, packed tight, with no loose soil. That told Hart something important. This tunnel was maintained. Not just used but kept. He slid forward, elbows tight, shotgun across his chest. The tunnel narrowed further, compressing him into a hunched crawl. Each movement had to be deliberate. Too fast and he could scrape the barrel, give away his position, or trigger a trap hidden beneath a thin layer of soil. At 8 feet in, the passage leveled out. Hart paused, letting the silence settle around him. 1 heartbeat. 2. 3. Then he heard it. Drip. A single drop of water falling onto clay deeper inside. Not loud. Not distinctive. But wrong. Water falling in a tunnel wasn't unusual. Water falling with rhythm was. He waited. Another drip. Then another. Each spaced almost evenly apart. That meant a source. A pull. Possibly condensation dripping from a crossbeam or from an improvised water catch. And if there was a water catch, there were inhabitants. He edged forward again until the tunnel bent slightly to the right. The bend forced him to angle the shotgun awkwardly, barrel nearly scraping the wall. Hart hated that posture. It reduced mobility and forced him to choose between speed and safety. He chose safety. He pressed his shoulder into the clay and eased the muzzle forward inch by inch until it cleared the bend. The passage beyond widened suddenly. The chamber. He could feel the space more than see it. The way sound expanded, how his breath didn't rebound as quickly, how the drip now echoed faintly rather than thudded. Hart steadied himself. He'd seen enough diagrams of VC tunnel architecture to know what this meant. A junction or waiting alcove used by sentries or fighters preparing to exit. He exhaled once, slow, almost silent. Then movement. Not a shadow. Not a flicker. A shift of air, faint but unmistakable, as if a body had repositioned. Hart froze. The chamber stayed quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that meant someone was listening. He angled the shotgun toward the center of the chamber. He couldn't see well, but he didn't need to, not with a scattergun. The Winchester was built for moments like this, where the difference between living and dying measured no more than the width of a doorway. A faint scrape answered him. Metal on clay. Then a breath. Small, forced, stifled. Hart fired. The blast punched through the chamber, swallowing the sound of the claustrophobic space. Dust erupted off the walls in a thick cloud, filling the air with choking grit. Hart chambered another round, its metallic clack lost in the echoing roar of disturbed earth. A muffled groan rolled from the darkness. Then another scrape, farther back this time. Someone was retreating. Hart pushed deeper, against better judgment, until he could see the faint outline of a body crumpled near the chamber's far wall. But the chamber had another exit, an upward slant on the left, barely visible through the haze. A secondary branch. Possibly a vent route. Possibly a firing slit. Possibly both. He didn't pursue. If he chased deeper, he'd be fighting blind. Instead, he reached back and rapped his knuckles twice against the tunnel wall, the prearranged signal to Rhodes. Clear immediate danger. Approaching threshold. Hold position. He waited, listening. The retreating footfalls shifted upward, then disappeared entirely. Someone had climbed into a vertical shaft. Hart scanned what he could of the chamber. It was larger than expected, 6, maybe 7 feet across. The VC had hollowed it cleanly, using wooden braces at the corners. A woven mat lay under the fallen body, likely used as a firing rest before emerging topside. Tools sat in a corner, shovels, a cracked enameled mug, and oiled cloth for an AK. Hart's breath grew heavier. Air quality was deteriorating. Too much dust, too little oxygen. He backed out slowly, dragging the shotgun along his chest to avoid snagging the barrel. Each foot backward felt like moving through syrup, the heat and dust pressing into his lungs. Sweat dripped from his chin. His arms trembled from the awkward angle. At the bend, he twisted, trying not to scrape the walls. At the incline, his breathing tightened. At the mouth, fresh air finally reached him, thin, cool, and sharp. He pulled himself out onto the ground and lay still for several seconds, chest heaving, face streaked with clay. Rhodes knelt beside him immediately. Jansen scanned the treeline, hands shaking slightly. "You okay?" Rhodes whispered. Hart nodded, gathering his breath. One down. Others moved to a vent shaft. Didn't pursue. Too many branches. Keller arrived moments later, eyes flicking from Hart's dust-caked uniform to the shotgun, whose barrel now carried fresh gouges of clay. "Well?" he asked. Hart sat up slowly. "This tunnel's different. They're using the chamber as a staging area. Heat's high, air's thin, structure's older. Whoever's inside knows the layout." "Could you clear it?" Keller asked, though the answer was already plain. Hart shook his head. "Not fully. But I can close the mouths. Keep them from using it to move north." The lieutenant nodded grimly. The ridge had spoken. 3 mouths. 3 fights. None simple, none clean. And though Hart's muscles trembled and dust clogged his throat, he rose, pumped the shotgun once and looked toward the slope. "One more to seal," he said. "Then we can deny them the whole system." At 7:42, they began preparing charges and marking structural weak points. The ridge felt awake now. Not just aware, but watching. By 8:03, the ridge had shifted from a series of isolated threats into a single, interconnected problem. Hart's team stood at the base of the slope, knees streaked with clay, breathing hard from the crawl out of the third tunnel. Keller crouched beside them, map open on his thigh, marking the 3 mouths with small black circles. Sunlight finally cut through the cloud bank, turning the damp air into a wavering curtain of heat. 3 entrances, Keller muttered. 1 staging chamber. Likely vents here, and higher up. He tapped the map with the eraser end of his pencil. "We shut these, we choke the whole line." The captain arrived minutes later, radio handset still clipped to his shoulder, face tight with concentration. He listened to Hart's full report, every detail: angles, air temperature, tunnel width, branch splits, the upward vent shaft, the traps. Hart explained calmly, voice steady despite the exhaustion settling into his limbs. "The third chamber connects to at least 1 vertical climb," Hart said. "They moved up it fast. They're regrouping, not retreating." "You think they'll try to counterattack?" the captain asked. "Not fully," Hart replied. "Just probes. Enough to test if we commit deeper. They know they can't hold once we seal the mouths, so they'll try to disrupt the sealing." The captain nodded grimly. "Then we don't give them the chance." The engineers had caught up with the platoon by then, lugging rucks heavy with C4, det cord, and improvised shoring tools. They were good at their jobs, calm, methodical, unhurried men who knew that mistakes underground didn't offer second chances. One of them, Sergeant Weller, knelt beside Hart and asked, "You sure about your read on the structure?" Hart nodded. "First mouth is shallow. Second's reinforced. Third's the deepest, oldest, but the throat's narrow. We collapse the narrow throats, leave the larger chambers sealed behind the rubble." Weller grinned faintly. Country boy logic. Hart didn't deny it. They started with the first entrance, small, straight, predictable. Engineers placed charges not inside the tunnel, but on the overhang above it, aiming to drop the earth downward into the passage. Rhodes and Jansen formed a perimeter while Keller's element scanned the treeline. The VC had a habit of watching silently from concealment, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. At 8:19, Weller set the last cap and signaled everyone back. The detonation was controlled, a dull inward pulse of sound that collapsed the lip of the ridge into a mound of dirt. Dust billowed outward, roots snapped, the entrance disappeared. Rhodes spotted movement in the treeline but no fire followed. 1 tunnel down. The second tunnel would be worse. Hart had already mapped the punji trap, the tripwire, the grenade cup buried in clay. Engineers moved with extreme caution, staying outside the mouth entirely. Hart explained the angles of the branches, the weak point he'd identified with the shotgun blast in the upper beam. Weller studied the slope. "We don't need to drop the whole roof. Just the front 10 feet. Force them to dig out from inside. Takes time they don't have." While Weller rigged the charges, Hart stood watch, shotgun angled downrange. Jansen scanned the left flank, hands tight on his rifle. Sweat dripped down his neck despite the morning stillness. The jungle seemed to hold its breath. Then, at the edge of the treeline, a soft crack. Not a gunshot. A twig. A warning. Hart whispered, eyes front. A shadow shifted between 2 bamboo stalks. Another figure crouched low, barely visible. The VC weren't forming an attack line. Not yet, but they were watching, calculating. Weller finished the last charge and gave the signal. The blast dropped half the slope into the tunnel mouth. This collapse was messier than the first. Chunks of clay, wooden braces, and a puff of orange dust rising like a breath from the earth itself. A muffled shout echoed somewhere inside, faint but unmistakable. A VC fighter caught in the collapse? Or one reacting to it from deeper inside? Either way, the entrance was sealed. Keller tapped Hart on the shoulder. "One more." Hart nodded. "The deep one." The third entrance looked the same as before, small, old, deceptively simple. But the air now pulsed with heat, and the soil trembled faintly beneath their feet, as if the ridgeline itself were adjusting to the loss of its other exits. Weller frowned. "This one's tricky. Collapse the throat wrong, you create a vent. Collapse it right, you choke the whole chamber." Hart knelt, studying the slope. "The weak point is here," he said, placing his hand on a slight ridge above the mouth. "This soil is looser. They widened the mouth but didn't reinforce the overhead. One shaped charge angled inward, low yield. Good, Weller said. We bury them alive without blowing the ridge open. Hart didn't react to the phrasing. There was nothing vindictive about it, it was simply the reality of subterranean war. Whoever was still inside had chosen the ground long before the Americans arrived. Rhodes murmured, movement upslope. Keller scanned the bough of bamboo. Small team. 3 or 4. Not closing. They were watching, close enough to see, far enough not to commit. Waiting for the Americans to make a mistake. Weller's team placed the charge, backed away and signaled ready. Fire it, the captain said. The explosion was sharp and focused. Soil collapsed in a column, folding downward like a throat closing on itself. Clay poured into the entrance. Wooden braces snapped, sending muted echoes down the shaft. The plume of dust rolled outward, then withdrew as the newly packed earth settled. Silence returned. Real silence. Not waiting silence. Not ambush silence. The silence of a passage sealed from within. Hart exhaled slowly. 3 mouths closed, Keller said. Not reopened any time soon, Weller added. The captain looked across the ridge, then at Hart's shotgun. Still caked with dust, still solid. Good work, he said, voice low. All of you. But Hart didn't feel relief. Not yet. The ridge still felt alive, a beast with 3 blocked nostrils, waiting to see whether it would suffocate or adapt. They would pull back soon. But first the engineers needed confirmation. And the platoon needed to know if the enemy would try one last desperate move. The fight above ground wasn't over. It had simply changed shape. By 9:04 the ridge had stopped shifting. The engineers waited several minutes after the last collapse, listening for telltale signs of internal settling, subterranean groans, shifting beams, or the sudden hollow echo that meant the earth was continuing to move on its own. None came. The ground lay still, sealed, quiet. Keller signaled the platoon into a defensive posture along the slope. Rhodes and Jansen took the forward arc. The rest spread into a semicircle, weapons trained on the tree line. The VC watchers were still out there, Hart could feel them, but they no longer seemed invested in the outcome. Their safe corridor was gone. The ridge had closed its doors. Weller ran gloved fingers through the clay at the third entrance, pressing lightly until the soil compacted under his touch. Solid, he said. They won't be using this one again. Keller exhaled. 3 mouths neutralized without sending a man inside deeper than 10 feet. That's unusual. Hart said nothing. His shirt clung to his back, dust streaked his arms, sweat made muddy tracks down his temples. He rested the Winchester across his lap, receiver warm, barrel pitted with new scratches. The weapon had performed exactly as he expected, not because it was extraordinary but because it was predictable. And in tunnels, predictability was survival. At 9:19 the jungle finally stirred. A single rustle in the bamboo. A silhouette slipping away upslope. Then another. Not an attack, just withdrawal. Quiet, orderly, unhurried. The VC fighters who had watched the Americans seal their entrances were now leaving the ridge behind. The network was no longer useful to them. The captain approached Hart with a field notebook in his hand. Corporal, he said, walk me through everything. Step by step. Hart did. Not dramatically. Not proudly. Just factually, angles of approach, distances inside the tunnels, what he saw, what he smelled, how the air changed, the traps, the branches, the chamber where the heat rose to a suffocating stillness. The captain wrote quickly, capturing every detail. And the shotgun? He asked at last. Hart turned the weapon over, showing the worn stock, the 2 brass screws, the dust-packed grooves in the slide. Worked, he said. Close range, tight spaces, nothing else gives you certainty like this. Not in a crawl way. The captain studied the gun with a new expression. Not admiration exactly, but a sober acknowledgement that the men who laughed at it had misunderstood something essential. You were right about the distances, he said. And about the angles. Didn't need to be pretty, Hart replied. Just needed to fire. When the platoon regrouped, the shift in perception was almost palpable. Men who had once joked about the junk shotgun, now asked quiet, pointed questions. How did handle recoil inside? Did the dust jam anything? Pattern hold up in clay like that? Hart answered the questions simply. He didn't embellish. He didn't soften the realities. He described exactly what mattered, that the pump didn't fail, that the buckshot stayed tight, that a weapon made for killing hogs in thick woods in Arkansas could still dictate a fight at arm's length inside a Vietnamese tunnel. The jokes didn't return. Not that day. Not after what the ridge had taken. By midday the engineers completed their survey. The ridge was stable. The tunnels were sealed. The company moved back toward the temporary fire support base, carrying exhaustion like an extra layer of gear. Some men limped. Others walked stiffly from adrenaline finally wearing off. Hart moved at a slow, even pace, shotgun slung across his chest, the stock tapping lightly against the strap with each step. When they reached the perimeter, the battalion XO was waiting, pen in hand, ready to capture the engineer-assisted denial of enemy subterranean structure. That was the phrase he used in the report. Sanitized. It didn't mention the ambush at the first tunnel, or the upward vent shaft in the second, or the suffocating heat chamber in the third. It didn't mention that a man with an outdated shotgun had crawled into the dark 3 times before breakfast. Hart read the typed summary later. It didn't anger him. But he noticed what was missing. The men in the platoon didn't miss it though. That evening, while the sky dimmed to copper and the first mortar tubes sounded in the distance, Rhodes set the ammunition box down beside Hart's cot. Inside were 3 shells, the same kind Hart had used that morning, and a folded note on top. In case you have to do that again. Rhodes and Jansen. No jokes. No nicknames. Just acknowledgement. The transformation spread quietly across the company. Soldiers who had once dismissed the shotgun as a relic now asked if they could try it at the range. The armorer, who used to roll his eyes at the patched stock, asked Hart if he wanted fresh screws, just in case the old ones give out. Keller wrote a private recommendation in his logbook. Hart's weapon selection, though unconventional, proved decisive in confined space engagements. It wasn't praise. It was evidence. Hart didn't keep souvenirs, but he did keep one thing from the ridge: the sensation of the tunnel walls brushing his shoulders, the hot breath of underground chambers, the knowledge that in the tightest places of the war, simplicity and certainty mattered more than doctrine. He rotated home in February of '68 with a combat infantryman badge, a scar on his forearm from the second tunnel's collapse, and a single photograph taken by Rhodes. In it, Hart sits on a sandbag wall, wiping dust from the 1897. He isn't smiling. Most men didn't smile after tunnel work. But there is a calm in his posture, a stillness in his eyes, the look of someone who had learned to operate where air thins, light dies, and decisions must be made between one breath and the next. Years later, an officer reviewing battalion reports for a study on subterranean warfare paused on the line about 3 tunnel mouths sealed with minimal penetration. He traced it back, found Keller's notation, found the armorer's repair entry, found the day's casualty logs. He never learned the full story. Official documents rarely held the full weight of the ground they described. But if he'd been standing on that ridge, breathing that dust, hearing that shotgun echo through cramped walls, he would have understood what the paperwork didn't say. Sometimes the right weapon is the one everyone else stopped believing in. Sometimes the right man is the one who never needed them to. And somewhere beneath 3 sealed mouths in Quang Nai, the silence still holds the shape of the morning when Corporal Lewis Hart carried an old pump gun into the tunnels, and didn't come out until the ridge changed.